Good evening, morning, afternoon. It's Jeffrey Coburn, and it's my pleasure to be speaking to you for a few minutes about the book of Melachim, the book of Kings, Sefer Melachim. It's a challenge. It's a real challenge to do justice to Sefer Melachim in the time that we have. It's like trying to summarize all of Shakespeare's histories and tragedies in a few minutes. So what we can try to do is to give some overview, some broad strokes, and hopefully offer some insight into what I see as a real magnificent, fascinating work. We did some short talks this past summer on it, and I'm going to draw on some of that, but hopefully give you a bigger overview and we can think about this together. To start with some structural notes, this is not really two books. We call it the book of Kings 1 and Kings 2, or Melachim Aleph and Melachim Bet. That's really a misnomer. It was one sefer, it was one book until the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible of Tanakh into Greek, divided it for technical reasons into two halves, which probably had to do with their technology and the scrolls and the length of things that they were able to put it into. And that's where where the prakim and the psukim, the chapters and verses, come from. So at that point, when the Septuagint was created, the book was split into two halves, but it really is one book, and it's important to look at it as one whole. Tradition has it, Gemara in Masechet Baba Batra tells us that the prophet Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, was the author of the book of Melachim, and he shows up in the final story, which is the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the first temple. We'll come back to that a little later, but he is the purported author of this book. Now, this book is populated by historical figures, real historical figures, but it is in no way a history book. And I think that's very important to note. As my friend, Rabbi Alex Israel, comments in his introduction to his wonderful book on Kings 1, which I'll plug right now shamelessly, because it's not my book. Rabbi Alex Israel, this is Kings 1, Torn in Two. He's another book that just came out more recently on Melachim Bet. He says this is a book with an overtly religious agenda. So even though there are kings and there are good guys and bad guys and good kings and bad kings and evil, and it's not a history, because it's a terrible history book. The chronologies all overlap. It's very difficult to follow. You literally need to chart everything. I do have a chart here. This is, again, from Rabbi Israel. This is the structure of the Book of Kings as a whole. You can see it begins with, let's see, I'm sorry that I'm doing this a little low tech, but you can see that it begins with the kingdom being established under David HaMelech, under King David, continuing with King Solomon, who builds that big, magnificent first temple, which we'll talk about a little bit in a moment. That kingdom then splits during the time of his son, Solomon's son Rechavam, into two kingdoms, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, and that continues through till the end. There's a lot of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between those two kingdoms. They unite, they fight, they fight, they unite, and the book ultimately ends with the destruction of that first Beit HaMikdash, that first temple. The book spans some 500 years of Jewish history, approximately. There's a ongoing tension, I think, throughout the Sefer, and it's something that I see playing out in our own lives today, about what the role of leadership is, what the role of religious leadership is, what the role of political leadership is, and the ongoing the two figures who butt heads throughout are the figures of the Navi, the prophet, and the Melech, the king. And it's an ongoing battle. It begins actually before Sefer Melachim even starts, back in the end of the book of Shmuel, of Samuel, when Samuel the prophet was not eager to have a king, begged God not to begged the people not to take a king. The people really wanted to have a king, and Samuel said, it's only going to end up bad for you. But God acquiesces, grants the people a king, and Shaul is the first king of Israel. He again appears in the second book of Shmuel, which is the stories of Shmuel and David. And David is the first united king that unites all of the tribes. People want a leader. And one of the things we see that I've seen in the times in which we're living right now is good leadership is so important, and when you see good leadership, we're drawn to it, and it helps us, it supports us, it can save lives. And the dearth of good leadership, the absence of good leadership, unfortunately can bring about the opposite. So it's something that is very, very relevant to what we're going through, I think, right now, which is what makes this 929 project so extremely relevant as we gear up for Pesach and learn our way through Tanakh. Now, this tension is redoubled when you have a Navi who is a direct line to God, and a king who is purportedly the leader that the people have chosen. My teacher, Rabbi Menachem Leibtag, has famously taught that the role of a king in the Judaic concept, rather, of a king, ideally should be something like this. You have the people, let's do a little, you have the people down here. The people look up toward the king. You know, the people looking up toward the king. But the idea is that the king is really supposed to draw their eye further up and further, higher, up to God, up to Hashem. This is what I wrote here. So the idea of a king in Jewish tradition is supposed to be, a pointer upwards. It doesn't always work out that way because ego gets in the way and political concerns get in the way. And that's really what makes this whole sefer, this whole book, so dramatic and so tense. How is the story told in this book? Let's talk about that for a moment. And the lens through which I'd like to look at that in the time that remains to us is a lens that comes from a book that I recently read and enjoyed, and I'll plug that one too, even though it has nothing to do with me. This is Robert Caro. Robert Caro, who I learned recently has direct descendancy, he thinks, from Rabbi Yosef Caro, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Robert Caro is a historian, the author of The Power Broker, which is the story of Robert Moses, the Parks Commissioner of New York City, and is, I think, 3 or 4 volumes into a biography of Lyndon Johnson. And he is fascinated with power and how power alters people and alters politics and alters the grand landscape as well as the micro landscape. And that's the lens through which I'd like to look at Sefer Melachim, because Sefer Melachim doesn't just speak in these broad brushstrokes, but it also tells the stories of individuals. And that's something that Caro, when he writes about writing about the Power Broker, Robert Moses was very careful. That's his approach. He wants to write about the big, broad stories, but also tell the stories of the individuals. So he had, for example, when he first started writing his book about Robert Moses, he said, I can't just tell the story about the Parks Department and the memos and the politics and the mayors and the governors. I need to also tell the stories of the people who were directly impacted by the policies and decisions he made. So, for example, when Robert Moses decreed that the Cross Bronx Expressway was going to go right through the middle of the Bronx, it caused 54 different apartment buildings to be destroyed and moved. So Caro went into that neighborhood, which was called East Tremont in the Bronx, a neighborhood that no longer exists because the Cross Bronx Expressway plowed right through the middle of it. And he interviewed people who had been displaced in the early 1950s by this huge public works project of building the Cross Bronx Expressway. That chapter was called 1 Mile. It was written up in the New Yorker. It was one of the things that got him the Pulitzer Prize. But why I mention all that is because the book of Malachim tells the big stories. You have these grand, larger-than-life figures of Elijah and King David and King Solomon and Elisha, the prophet, but you also have the regular people. And the camera, as it were, goes back and forth from the close-up to the wide-angle lens and back to the close-up, and tells the stories both of the major power players as well as the individuals who are impacted by those decisions, the decisions that those powerful people make. And it's a fascinating way to tell the story, and I think that's the real story. So you have the story of the starving woman of Shunam, the Isha Shunamit, who begs the prophet Elisha for food, and he says, bring out all of the kelim, bring out all the pots and pans and and jugs that you have in your house, and they were miraculously filled with oil. You have the story of 4 Mitzoraim, the 4 lepers, who found themselves suddenly outside a camp of Aram, who were one of the enemies who were about to attack Israel, and that God caused a miracle to happen, and everyone in the camp, all the soldiers fled, and leaving behind everything, their horses, their provisions, everything like that. And these 4 lepers make their way in there. So the story is told through the vantage point, not just of the big Cecil B. DeMille epic, but it's also told at the individual level by the little guys. I think that's important. And at the same time, you have these scenes of great drama and great confrontation. So, for example, in the first book of Kings, Malachim Aleph, Perek Yud Chet, the 18th chapter, is the famous story of the confrontation between the prophet Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi, and the prophets of Baal, where the Jewish people had been not so loyal to God. They had been worshiping Baal, and there had been a famine for a long time in the land. Elijah said, all right, let's do this publicly, and picked a spot on Hara Carmel, on Mount Carmel in the north, and did a public confrontation between the prophets of Baal and himself, whose sacrifice, whose korban would be accepted by God. And after a day and a half of long drama, and the other prophets trying to, calling out to God and cutting themselves and bleeding and doing all kinds of stuff, Elijah very publicly and very disdainfully and very effectively made it clear that God was the true God. Fire shot down from heaven onto his altar, consuming his sacrifice on an altar that he had built out of 12 stones, symbolizing the 12 different tribes of Israel. And the prophets of Baal are thereby vanquished. The people go and kill them. It's a very public, huge moment. The book begins with the descriptions of the majesty and magnificence of the temple that Solomon builds. And it's through this contrast and comparison, again, of the stories of the little guys, the 4 lepers, and the gigantic edifice that is the temple, that we get the story of who the Jewish people were, from their leaders down to the regular people. And remember, it's that same Solomon who built that magnificent temple with all the details that are detailed in the first few chapters of the book of Kings 1, of Malachim Aleph. That same Solomon then goes out to judge the people, and 2 prostitutes, 2 harlots, come to him and tell him that they're both the mother of this one baby, and he has to decide who the mother is. And that's the famous story of him asking for the baby to be cut in half. This is the story of the Jewish people. It happens at the micro level, it happens at the macro level, it happens at both levels at the same time. The time that we're living through now, the days that we're living through now, we live obviously at our micro level. We're concerned about our families, we're concerned about those we love, we're concerned about people in our community. At the same time, we're following the story on the macro level, watching those who lead us, watching those who make important, gigantic political decisions with huge ramifications, and we're watching that play out at the same time. I cannot think of a more relevant sefer than this to be looking at this time, and it's an honor to share some of these thoughts with you. Enjoy learning.